It sounds like we have several people on YouTube.
I have a hard time hearing you, Emily. I don't know if that's volume or it's just really low. The
Hear me
volume is
now?
really low.
Try turning up the gain.
Oh, I can hear you now a little bit.
Oh, there we go. There are people waiting on YouTube.
Okay. So good morning to all of you. My name is Nathaniel Rich. Lama Rigzin and Lama Namgyel were in retreat in New Mexico over the holidays and are now, I believe, on the road, probably somewhere in the wilds of West Texas. So they asked me to offer a Dharma reflection this morning and lead the meditation. And because it's the first Sunday in January, it seemed appropriate to begin with a brief personal reflection on New Year's from a Buddhist perspective, or from the perspective of one Buddhist at the very least. Thinking about what spiritual lessons or Dharma lessons New Year's might have to teach me, I've found myself pulled in two directions. On the one hand, maybe the most obvious direction, in the direction of impermanence, reflecting on the fact of impermanence, which is obvious because New Year's, after all, is a holiday whose sole purpose is to mark the passage of time. On the other hand, I find myself pulled in the direction of reflecting on the possibility of positive change. This too is probably obvious, right? New Year's resolutions, new year, new you. Whether you're the sort of person who starts January every year earnestly or cynically, it's hard to avoid that cultural sentiment that the new year either is or ought to be a new beginning, an occasion for letting some things like bad habits go, taking some things up. My favorite New Year's joke this year has been that my own New Year's resolution is to stop procrastinating, which I plan to do next week. So thinking about these two themes, let's say, or possible lessons that the New Year's might have for us, that is impermanence and the possibility of positive change. To start with impermanence, again, obvious in the context of a holiday whose purpose is to mark the passage of time, the passing away of an old year and the beginning of a new year, which is to say, if we use a Tibetan term, we find ourselves now in a kind of bardo. Bardo is a word that means literally in between, or you might say transitions. Although now 1 week into the new year, we've been in this transitional stage of saying goodbye to 2023 and welcoming 2024, either hopefully or with a feeling of dread, maybe both. So it's really difficult, at least for me, to avoid thinking about impermanence at this time of year. Now, in the context of Buddhist practice, when we reflect on impermanence, which is a very important part of Buddhist practice, as many of you might know, I think most often what we find ourselves reflecting upon, what we're instructed to reflect upon when we reflect upon the fact of impermanence, is to reflect upon the fact of death, the inevitability of death, the fact that everyone will someday die, the fact that the time of death, cause of death, all of that is uncertain. This is probably something that you're familiar with if you're familiar at all with Buddhist practice. But the contemplation on impermanence includes a great deal more than just the fact of death. There's a couple of very famous sutras or discourses in the Buddhist canon which are aptly called Discourse on Impermanence. And we find these actually in multiple Buddhist traditions. And at the very beginning of the first of those two discourses, the Buddha begins by telling his listeners all conditioned states are impermanent, uncertain, unreliable, subject to change. So it isn't just that everything that is born will die. What the fact of impermanence means for us as practitioners, what we are called upon to contemplate when we contemplate the fact of impermanence, is the more general fact that everything whose existence depends on causes and conditions. This is what the Buddha meant by this term conditioned states. That is our bodies, our minds, our identities, our relationships, our worlds. All of that is not for sure. All of it is liable not just to break down, but to become different, to become otherwise, to become something else, to change whether we want it to or not. And even that, our wanting, that changes too. Our wants are also, in the end, unreliable. And for me, perhaps for you too, I often find that the holidays and the new year tend to be full of reminders about this sort of thing. And maybe that's because the way that I often spend the holidays is to travel back to where I grew up to visit family. I currently live in California. I'm with you this morning from a hotel room in Simi Valley, California. I grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, where most of my family still lives. I have just returned from there with my wife and children, where we spent a week over the holidays, including the new year. And it could be that this time of year is one in which I naturally find myself a bit pensive, or I'm liable to brood. But it is interesting reflecting now on this theme from a Buddhist perspective, how many reminders of that kind of impermanence, that is, that things just change, they become otherwise, are present for me during the holidays. So when I returned to Fort Worth, my parents don't live in the house that I grew up in. They now live somewhere else. My siblings don't live with my parents anymore. They're all grown up and out of the house, just like I am. I often find that my relationships with those family members, my parents, my siblings, are not always exactly as I remembered them. In some cases, they're better. In some cases, they're not. In all of those cases, though, when I'm there and confronted with the reality of those relationships in a kind of naturally stressful circumstance like gathering for the holidays, what I find myself thinking is that each of these relationships, these interactions, are often kind of whispering to me about the fact of impermanence. There are Buddhist sutras that describe realms that we often call in English Pure Lands or Buddha realms, which are almost like heavenly realms or paradises, states of existence in which you might find yourself in the presence of a Buddha and in the presence of bodhisattvas and other great practitioners, where there are no obstacles to the practice of Dharma. And one of the things that's often said in these descriptions about these places is that the trees and the flowers and the birds, when they sing, are all whispering, singing, saying emptiness, compassion. That is, they're all teaching the Dharma in their own way. Now, I don't live in a Pure Land, and Fort Worth is not a Pure Land for me, but I found myself thinking that there's maybe a way in which, when I'm home for the holidays, celebrating Christmas and the New Year with family, that everything in that surrounding is kind of whispering to me impermanence. Things change. Things aren't the same. Things don't stay the same. Now, this can be kind of unsettling, to be sure, and recognizing the fact that it's unsettling is a part of practice. But there's also a sense in which this is just a reality that we have to confront and that we have to learn to recognize, and that we have to navigate in our lives and in our practice. And so for me, thinking about the new year, this is the most natural, the most obvious, the one that's most in my face, I think. Um, and from a perspective of practice, what it reminds me of is that when I sit to do my daily practice, let's say, which might involve the contemplation on death, it can be important to remember that death is not the only aspect of impermanence that we have to recognize. And one hopes that in most days of our lives, we're not confronted directly with the reality of death. One hopes that the people that we love are not dying today and won't die tomorrow. We certainly hope that we will not die today or tomorrow. I think all of us live in a place where we're not surrounded by death and destruction. We all know this is not true for many people in the world. So probably most of us are now fortunate that we're not directly confronted with death every single day. But what we are directly confronted with every single day, nevertheless, is the fact of impermanence. The fact that the things in our lives change, the things in our lives become otherwise, things that were once good become not good, things that once brought us joy no longer bring us joy, things become boring. Like all of these very mundane, ordinary aspects of experience. Each of these is like the birds in the Pure Land that are kind of whispering to us about the fact that things that are conditioned, everything in our lives, is impermanent. And we often find ourselves wanting to hold on to things, wanting to push things away. And what in each of those cases that involves, in part, is failing to recognize or resisting the recognition that everything in the end is impermanent. Now, directly related to that fact of impermanence, maybe a little more positively, is that there is always the possibility of positive change. Now, again, this is something that is in the air around New Year's. Again, whether people are earnest about it or whether they're cynical about it, the new year tends to confront us at least with the possibility of making positive changes. And this is true in most cultures where the new year involves reflecting on things from the past year that we want to be rid of, want to let go of, and things that we want to bring into our lives that are positive in the new year. Now, we probably all know now that the simple fact that one year ends and another begins makes no real difference, does it? There's nothing magical, at least for me, that happens when the clock strikes midnight on December 31st. And apart from a hangover, maybe, you probably didn't feel any different on the morning of January 1st than you did on the morning of December 31st. And part of me wonders if this is why it's so easy to be cynical about New Year's resolutions or about some people's sunny optimism at the beginning of January. It seems like it's very common for people to hope that things will be different, as an old year ends and a new year begins, only for them not to be come the first week of January or the end of January. It's common for people, maybe it's common for you, it's certainly been common for me, to run right into the brick wall of habit and inertia when I'm trying to stop doing something or start doing something. And it's easy to be cynical about that. It can be a real challenge to accept the fact that change requires intentional and persistent acts of effort day after day, again and again and again. This is very challenging. And whether we have experienced this ourselves with New Year's resolutions, whether we know people who make resolutions and then fail at them, I wonder if part of what is involved there is that we naively hope that it would simply be easy, that the passage of time, the changing of the calendar, the beginning of a new year would simply mean without any real effort that things could be different. And in my own experience, at least, what I think I have learned about myself is that when I have made resolutions in the past around the new year, and I have, that what I have the mistake that I've made is to think of the new year as if it were some, again, to use some Buddhist language here, some inherently existent thing, some real thing independently existing out there somehow, and that the new year would inherently involve something new. And this might be the sort of thing that should have been obvious, to me as I've aged, but that turns out not to be the case. And that conceptualizing an entire year and making a change once and for all, or starting something new for an entire year, feels much, much larger than it really is. Because the reality is that every day is another day and another opportunity. It isn't once and for all, I've stopped this bad habit, I've started this new habit. It's that every day has to be, in some sense, like the new year. That is, it's very difficult to commit to something, against the horizon of an entire year, let's say, because it's very easy to then feel overwhelmed by the enormity of that unit of time, let's say. But if I then recognize that, in fact, there's nothing really different from December 31st to January 1st, except a calendar, which is a cultural construct. The passage of time might be, let's say, natural, but whether we adopt a solar calendar or a lunar calendar, the way that we count the months, when we decide to celebrate, these are all cultural constructs. And really nothing changes from December 31st to January 1st, really. So there is, in a sense, no new year, you might say. In Buddhist terms, we would just say that the new year is empty, doesn't have any self. But from the perspective of wanting to make some positive change, let's say, I have found it helpful to think of each day as if it were a new year. And so if I want to make the effort to let go of an old habit or a bad habit, if I want to start a new habit, a positive habit, some new practice, let's say, then for me, at least, what's helpful is to think of each day as if that day were a new year, let's say. And today I'm going to let go of that bad habit. Today I'm going to sit down and practice. I cannot say for sure what tomorrow will bring, but I can commit today to making this a kind of new year. So my resolution is not for the new year. My resolution is for today. And then it could be that tomorrow, when I awake, I can make that resolution again for that day. And so, I let go entirely of the idea that I've made a New Year's resolution. And I have simply tried to make the effort every day to resolve to do something that day. And for me, this is something that I am, this way of thinking about positive change is something that I attribute to Lama Rigzin. About 12 years ago, I can remember Lama Rigzin and Lama Namgyal teaching a retreat at the beginning of a program on the foundational practices, or Ngundro. Now, I had been introduced to the foundational practices by Atam Rinpoche and by Lama Rigzin and Lama Namgyal many years prior to that. And I had always had this aspiration to practice the Ngundro and to complete the accumulations. For anyone who doesn't know, the Ngundro involve a series of practices that are foundational for all practice in Tibetan Buddhism and in this lineage. And when one begins that practice, one doesn't just commit to practicing it every day, but ultimately to completing accumulations of each of the practices, 100,000 of each. So, for example, 100,000 full-length prostrations that one performs while reciting the refuge prayer. And this can seem very daunting. This is quite daunting, at least for someone like me. And I was introduced to them very young and always had this aspiration and never established the habit, or I should say, never maintained the habit of practicing them. And so about 12 years ago, Lama Rigzin and Lama Namgyal taught a retreat at the beginning of a program for those who wanted to commit to the foundational practices. And I have to confess that the only thing that really stuck in my memory from that retreat was something that Lama Rigzin said almost, I don't want to say casually, but it was at the beginning. And it wasn't really a part of instruction about the practices themselves. She was simply talking about the fact that in this lineage, one is expected, if one commits to it, to perform the Ngondro liturgy every day. And she said that establishing a daily practice is itself a practice. So it isn't just that the liturgy that you recite and the meditations that that liturgy includes, it's very easy to think of that as the practice. In some sense, that is the practice. But she said, just committing and maintaining the habit of doing that every day, that too is a practice. Because when you do that, when you make the effort to do that every day, and you're able to maintain that habit, what you learn is that how you feel, that is what your, let's say, feelings, what your mood is on any given day, is of course something to recognize and be aware of, not to push it away or suppress it, but doesn't have to be what guides you. It doesn't have to be the arbiter or the decider. Your mood on any given day, how you feel, doesn't have to decide what you do. And this turned out for me, in fact, to be the most profound thing that I learned that weekend. And of course, the foundational practices are themselves quite profound. Any of you who have done them, I'm sure, have discovered this, especially if you've done them over a long period of time. But what I am often reminded of is that what was most profound for me and what was most impactful for me in beginning the practice of the Ngondro was what Lama Rigzin said about the habit of a daily practice. Because it means that what it has meant for me, I should say, is that, whether the meditation on any given day is good or not, the simple fact of committing to it and keeping that commitment has a real power. And it wasn't obvious at the beginning. And it was something that I, heard her say, thought was very interesting. I never heard it said that way before. And then should say I was able to maintain a kind of daily practice for the first time in my life. And it was later that I then remembered that she had said that. And it would come back to me on a day when I would sit down to practice, not in the mood to practice, for example, but would do it anyway. Because I remember the way that she said it was, you might not want to practice that day. You recognize that you don't want to practice, and you do it anyway. And it was that habit of doing it anyway that over the years proved to be very helpful for me. And it was a lesson that I have found myself applying in other avenues or other areas of my life. So, for example, I have two young children. The reason why I'm in Simi Valley is because my 10-year-old has a soccer tournament. Maybe some of you have had this kind of experience before where you have to get up at 6 a.m. on a Saturday because your son has to be at the soccer field at 7 a.m. Probably not hard for you to imagine this is not the way that I prefer to spend my Saturday morning. Of course, it's important for me to recognize, not push away the feelings that come up. That's a part of daily life. It's a part of practice. And in this case, to then do it anyway. And so I found this to be this was almost, and I don't know that Lama Rigzin would, I might embarrass her by saying it this way. I don't think she would say that, say it this way. But for me, that was a kind of mengak, to use the Tibetan term, a kind of quintessential instruction. You commit yourself to something that is positive, that is positive. And then you maintain that commitment every day, regardless of how you feel. Not because how you feel isn't important, but because how you feel doesn't have to be what ultimately guides you on any given day. Because, as I said at the beginning, our feelings are like everything else conditioned. They change, they're impermanent. The way that you feel from day to day is not the same. And so if you let yourself primarily be guided by how you feel at any given moment, then unfortunately, what you have then is an unreliable guide for living. And so I don't know that I will be successful at any particular New Year's resolution that I might make. But what I do know is that one way to approach a New Year's resolution is to not think in terms of a new year, but just in terms of a new day. And that horizon might make it easier to make that commitment and to keep that commitment. Just today, this is what I will resolve to do. And then when you wake up in the following morning, today I will resolve to do this. And then what you might find is after a string of days, you have yourself a new habit. Now, I also wanted to share with you over the course of Sunday meditations, Lama Riggs and Lama Namgyel have been reading a book by the Venerable Pema Chudron called Comfortable with Uncertainty, 108 teachings on cultivating fearlessness. And they have now been through the first 30 of those teachings. They're brief vignettes. And so for the sake of continuity, I wanted to share with you the 31st teaching from that book called Heaven and Hell. And I offer this for your reflection before we begin the guided meditation. A big, burly samurai comes to a Zen master and says, "Tell me the nature of heaven and hell." The Zen master looks him in the face and says, "Why should I tell a scruffy, disgusting, miserable slob like you, a worm like you? Do you think I should tell you anything?" Consumed by rage, the samurai draws his sword and raises it to cut off the master's head. The Zen master says, "That's hell." Instantly, the samurai understands that he has just created his own hell, black and hot, filled with hatred, self-protection, anger, and resentment. He sees that he was so deep in hell that he was ready to kill someone. Tears fill his eyes as he puts his palms together to bow in gratitude for this insight. The Zen master says, "That's heaven." The view of the warrior bodhisattva is not hell is bad and heaven is good, or get rid of hell and just seek heaven. Instead, we encourage ourselves to develop an open heart and an open mind to heaven, to hell, to everything. Only with this kind of equanimity can we realize that no matter what comes along, we're always standing in the middle of a sacred space. Only with equanimity can we see that everything that comes into our circle has come to teach us what we need to know. So now we will begin our meditation. Before we do that, it might be helpful to stretch, take a few deep breaths, stand up. I might do that myself for a moment.